things are optimistic for us. I mean, there are certain things that are going our way, but there are things that even the government needs to have a right policy for being able to capitalize on this window of opportunity. So I think we have a short window of opportunity for of about 5 to 7 years. I think geostrategically we are well placed. So the geostrategic warrants the companies that have invested in China to move out, both because of the pressure that US has created and the pressures that China itself has created on its private enterprises.
Welcome to the Gist on StratNewsGlobal. Good evening, I'm Surya Gangadharan, and you're watching another edition of The Gist. This evening, we're going to look at India's critical dependencies vis-a-vis China, and obviously the one point that comes to mind is trade, where we have at least a $50 billion deficit. Government has made various efforts to try and reduce this. There's been some success, but clearly we have a long way to go. To discuss this, I'm going to talk to Amit Kumar. You've met him on our channel before. He's with the Takshashila Institution, a research analyst in the program for Indo-Pacific Studies. So, Amit, good to have you again.
Thank you for having me.
Amit, let's cut to the chase. How would you define a critical dependency and a critical vulnerability? I mean, these are big fat words for lay people like me, but how would you, in simple terms, describe it to people like us?
So I'll just give a bit of context. For the past 3 to 4 years, governments across the world have been grappling with this very question concerning what constitutes strategic and critical vulnerabilities in trade relationship, right? And the central question remained: does dependence in an asymmetric relationship make us strategically or critically vulnerable? Of course, the debate began during Trump's latter years in the U.S. office, and it was then that the ideas such as decoupling and self-reliance started to gain traction, especially in the context of the relationship with China, right? And what lent credence to this idea was China's prowess as the center of global manufacturing hub, and its increasing willingness to deploy economic tactics vis-a-vis other states, as it did with Japan, South Korea, or Australia, right? And the pandemic gave further fillip to this idea around decoupling. But in a span of 4 years, the world has realized that China cannot be wished away, and any attempts towards a broad-based decoupling will come at a huge cost, economic cost to them, and also that it seems largely impossible, right? And thus, from decoupling and self-reliance, the debate has shifted to de-risking and diversifying, and that too in strategic and critical segments, right? And this itself tells us that there exists a lack of conceptual clarity on questions like: does every kind of dependence on external trade dependence constitute a vulnerability, or are there specific conditions that classify a dependence as vulnerability? Moreover, are all vulnerabilities the same, or are there different types of vulnerabilities requiring specific kinds of treatment, right? So, and thus to optimize this state responses, we at Takshashila worked on a paper, and we came out with a paper where we have come out with a definition on strategic and critical vulnerabilities. So, to determine whether a case of dependence, say any product or service in a trade relationship, constitutes a strategic vulnerability, we need to put it through four-stage test, right? The first test is, of course, the adversary test. It has to be vis-a-vis an adversary. You cannot say that because India is dependent on EU for something, we are vulnerable, because only an adversary would have some strategic motivation to employ those economic ways, right? The second test is alternative test, or the test of substitutability. Whether you have alternatives in the market for that products, either in terms of source or again product. So let's say you have a product wherein you are dependent for about 60% of your supplies on a particular country. But if you also have an alternative product that could replace the product, or or an alternative source that supplies that same product, this idea of strategic vulnerability does not arise because you can always upscale your supplies from other sources, right? The other test is of that of the test of incidence. So this test actually measures the impact of disruption on general population against two factors. It could be the section of the people affected and the utility of the product that itself is in the question. So let's say for a luxury item that caters to around 3 to 4% of the general population, but in that luxury item you are 100% dependent on China, it might not constitute a strategic vulnerability.
Yeah.
Why would it? I mean, large scale of population is not affected, and it is not a commodity which has high utility in terms of affecting the daily functioning of people's life, right? And similarly, toys of firecrackers. Even though India depends on like 70%, I mean, just for example, if India depends on China for like 70 to 80% of its supply on soft toys, decoratives, firecrackers, it cannot be called as a case of strategic vulnerability, because
Vulnerability.
what
Yeah.
gain would China? Yeah, it would not uh, help China in any way, right? The
Yeah.
last test is that of test of cascading effect. So this measures the impact of disruption in the traded product on other domestic sectors within the supply chain or the value chain and beyond. So in case of an intermediate good that is being traded, if it has impact on other sectors, let's say for example, if you are importing semiconductors, so not only the semiconductor industry will be impacted, but also industry of assembling of laptops, phones, other electronic items will be affected. And similarly, with the case of APIs, the APIs that India depends upon
Concept
around
ingredients.
60% of it. 60% of its
Yeah.
supplies from China. So if
China.
there's a disruption in this sector, of course, it will dent India's status as the uh, uh, global medicinal hub for the world, and it will dent its the production of generic medicine, which the world depends on India, right? So these are the factors which would determine, these four tests would determine whether a case of dependence is a strategic vulnerability or not. Now, coming on to the second part of the question on critical vulnerabilities. So these critical vulnerabilities are also a subset of strategic vulnerabilities. But to fulfill, to determine whether they are critical vulnerabilities, they need to fulfill two additional criteria. That is one on the national security test. The second is capability gap. So the national security test, for example, dependence on adversaries' investment or technology uh, in electricity grids, communications, satellites, banking and finance, right, and C4 ISR related sectors. These would constitute a critical vulnerability, because any disruption in these sectors would uh, instantly bring the country on its knees, right, on
It
for a
is.
short
Yeah.
period of time, where it will have a
Yeah.
weaker hand in negotiations. The
Mhm.
capability gap is an important factor, and we see this play out in the case of semiconductors. So the capability gap would measure or test a case of strategic vulnerability vis-a-vis an adversary leading to a product of sophisticated and specialized technology that cannot be replicated in short to medium term, uh, and instead
Mhm.
could instead take decadal effort. For example, if you look at the chips, advanced chips value chain, China is critically dependent on the US-led ecosystem, and China on its
Mhm.
own cannot have uh, a role in the world or sub value chain that the US has, and it is absolutely critically dependent on the US for its supplies of advanced chips. So these are the factors that go into defining strategic and critical vulnerabilities.
Mhm. Now, you mentioned semiconductor chips as a area of vulnerability for India. Can you mention any other areas that could give India a lot of damage if China were to exercise that option? Any other products, items, equipment?
So I did not mention chips vis-a-vis as a vulnerability vis-a-vis India. It's a specific case of vulnerability for China. For India, if you look at the chips value chain, India does not depend on China for the
Alone,
larger,
okay.
larger India is if India it will not pass the adversary test, because a large
Okay.
part of the value chain is situated in the or is under the control of the US, right? And China is only involved in assembling of those chips and packaging of those chips, which can be taken up by other countries such as Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And even India now, there are talks of erecting other fabs in India.
Yeah.
But if you look at, I have to look at strategic vulnerabilities. So we are still not at Takshila. We are still not at that stage. We can have put every particular uh, trade item through these tests and identified which are the areas where we are critically or strategic vulnerable. I mean, we'll have to go through a lot of brainstorming and pinpoint as to
Mhm.
what those sectors could be. So we are still in that process, and it would be
Mhm.
unfair to have a verdict as of now.
Okay. Now, given the fact that we have a huge trade deficit with China, not $50 billion, more like $100 billion,
Right.
what is it that they can do to us? What can we do to them? I mean, it's something that is talked about a lot here, and various measures have been taken. But what specifically can they does it do to us?
Uh, so far, interestingly, China has been very eager to employ those economic coercion with respect to other countries. But so far as India is concerned, China has not sought to weaponize its position as a dominant trading partner against India. If our listeners can recall, it is India that has conveyed that business as usual cannot be carried unless there's peace and
Yeah,
tranquility at the borders. China's
yeah.
position has largely been that India should not be myopic and learn to keep the border question at its proper place and not let
Hmm.
the border question derail the overall development of the broader bilateral relations. So this is a contrasting case that we have encountered, wherein China has not been very keen on weaponizing its position in the trading order against India. But to answer your question, are we completely? I mean, what can China do to us? I mean, yes. I mean, a dependency is not a one-way thing. A dependency, a buyer is as much, or a
The
seller
market,
is
yeah,
as much dependent on a buyer as the buyer is
yeah,
on the seller, right? Yeah. So but the fact is, who has got the greater willingness to employ those tactics, and who has the greater appetite to withhold uh, or digest that cost. So
Mhm.
China indeed has the capability to hurt India. And of course, if you would ask me what segments of trade that could be, we'll have to again put those
Yeah,
items uh, through this framework. And it often can emerge that things that might not lead to us, might not give China a strategic advantage. You might think that these are things that might hurt us, and we may progress towards banning those items. Like recently, the case of banning Chinese-made laptops made in
yeah.
China that we encountered yesterday. I don't think that's a case which makes India strategically vulnerable. I think this decision needs to be thought through, and of course, because I mean, as it indicated, government had to revise its deadline for the ban. So it indicates there are certain confusion in the government. Uh, but yeah, so these are the things that we need to be aware of.
So, why do you think China has not weaponized the trade weapon against India? Is it because they know they can't do it? They need the Indian market. It provides, a level of comfort at a time when their own economy is not doing too great.
So I can take a guess. So with countries that it has employed this economic tool of economic coercion, it has yet not crossed the I would say the threshold in that relationship. For example, with respect to Korea, vis-a-vis Australia or Japan. But with India, if you look at the relationship is so strained that it has I think has gone the threshold has been crossed. India and China are already at loggerheads, and
Yeah.
they have 60,000 troops lined up in Ladakh. So the threshold is too high, and I think deteriorating the trade relation wouldn't do any better to the ongoing relation or the state of bilateral relations. So I think we have already reached that stage where the economic coercion would not work, and direct military coercion has been the order. So I think this could be my guess.
So, Amit, what can India do to counter this? Um, I know we have started something called trusted sources, and there's some kind of a move to make stuff here locally that we are currently importing from China.
Right.
Is that how this counter generally moves?
Uh, okay. So unfortunately, at this juncture, if trade dependence has to be reduced, uh, we need to trade more and not trade less. One and point number one. And if we have to reduce critical vulnerabilities and strategic vulnerabilities. I think India at this juncture has adopted a policy that reflects there's some confusion over the sectors, on which sectors to target and which sectors should be left alone. For example, I think in April 2020, India released Press Note 3, which extended the existing scrutiny over investments from Pakistan and Bangladesh to all bordering states. And that, of course, uh, the target here was China. The biggest impact of this was on investments from China. Going forward, all Chinese investments would be scrutinized by the government for clearance. Consequently, between the release of the note in March 2022, in a reply that was given the Parliament, uh, only 66 of the 347 Chinese applications worth around 13 to 14,000 crores were approved, and the government approval route has impacted. Chinese investments in India. And while the official figures published by the RBI show a drop in from China, reports claim that a large number of indirect investments have made inroads in India through illegal routes or through by circumventing government uh, machinery that have been placed in that has been placed in. But and the problem with this is that there's no concrete record of how much of Chinese investment is coming into India. And so if this creates a challenging situation for the government also to monitor obscure Chinese investments, subjecting
Mhm.
all Chinese investments or uh, trade products that are traded between India and China burdens India's scrutinizing bodies and makes this an efficient exercise. So I don't think
Yeah.
this is the way to go around. I think uh, there has to be smart. The government has to smartly pick up those sectors and those areas where it is actually and not there's not it's not perceived, but it's actually strategically and critically vulnerable, and rather enforce its focus its agencies on those particular sectors to determine if there are any investments coming into those areas which make India vulnerable, rather than adopting a broad-based approach wherein all sectors and all trading products are subjected to increased scrutiny, and there is because we need China. China cannot be wished away, and it's
Yeah. Yeah.
an unfortunate fact that we have to accept. It would have been great if we could have wished away China and have all of this to ourselves. But it's an unfortunate fact that we need China, and we need to be smart with this in areas where we can work and which can actually benefit India. India needs to work with China for its own sake, but where China's interest could be harming and could lead to vulnerabilities, India needs to block those areas and you know have capabilities develop domestically itself, or rely on the partners or allies.
Interesting. Now, we've talked in terms of how China is the adversary. Now, if you look at our trade with the US, it's more than $100 billion.
Right.
I'm not sure about the figure. And European Union, the trade there is also pretty substantial. And there's a lot of high tech stuff coming in from there. Would you say that's
Right.
also a vulnerability for us?
No, not absolutely not. Because see, what the how the game in the chips value chain has played out till now. It has made the world, actually even China, very clear that US envisages a uh, two way, or I would say two separate ecosystems. Yeah, two separate ecosystems wherein China is not part of that system or ecosystem, and the other ecosystem is led by US with support from its allies, Japan, EU, Netherlands, uh, South Korea, and India has a role in it, right? We saw the uh, momentous and the great announcement that we saw during the India-US Modi's visit to the US, and the announcement of the ISETs. So India is very much part of that ecosystem
Okay.
that is led by the US, and US has because a lot of these high tech products rely on US technologies. The it is very difficult for European Union and particularly countries like Netherlands or Japan and even UK to actually separate themselves from this ecosystem, and even if they want to work with China, right? And we saw this
Mhm.
happening in the case of the trilateral agreement that happened and that was concluded between the US, Netherlands, and Japan. US was actually successful in coercing these two countries to stop the sale of the lithography equipments to China,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
even though they are the largest market producers, market leaders in producing these lithography equipment. What they do actually need the US for is the technology that is required to manufacturing of this tools. So it is very difficult for other countries of the EU to separate from the US. And the good news for us is that we are very much seen favorably in this ecosystem, and it's actually a disadvantage to China. And this is why we see all the cries from the government, from the state council, of that this is anti-globalization trends. China, US is paranoid. US you should come back to the negotiating table and not have this, and the regular complaints that we see on the WTO platforms. So I don't think we need to worry about these high-tech imports that we are incurring from the US and the European ecosystem. We are very much part of the ecosystem and will benefit. Actually, there are companies that have now stated interest to set up uh, the fabs in India. So these are just evidences that we are very much part of this ecosystem, and we do not need to uh, uh, do anything funny with this situation. We are sorted in this
Okay.
case.
Okay. Then how would you define Russia? It's a friend, but it's embroiled in some war in some parts of the world, and it has hit us, and we are
Right.
dependent on them for very sensitive military technologies.
Right.
How would you define that dependence?
So Russia presents an interesting case. So if you look at the outset, that the test that I've identified, the four tests of strategic vulnerability, you might at the outset say that Russia does not meet or qualify the adversary test, right? Because it's a strategic partner. India has a privileged partnership with Russia. Russia has been friend for a long time, but that is from a strategic perspective, right? But for the sake of this paper, what I've also outlined is that while putting a country or putting a product through this adversary test, you need to also look out for situations wherein the country might not be an adversary in the common strategic sense, but it might be qualified as an extended adversary if it has relationship with an staunch
Mhm.
with a concrete uh, adversary of yours. And in this
Yeah.
case, Russia's relationship with China is a matter that has to be a factor that has to be accounted in, and that makes Russia, even though in the common strategic parlance, we do not like to call it. We do not call it an adversary, and rather strategically or a strategic partner or privileged partner. Russia would still qualify to be an extended adversary because of its relationship with China. So yes,
Okay.
India's dependencies in terms of the spares, the weaponology, and other military equipments with regard with vis-a-vis Russia is a matter of critical vulnerability, not even strategic vulnerability, but critical vulnerability. And the vulnerability comes from not the uh, weapons that we have already ordered, we already have, or we'll place
Yeah.
in the future. But for the part of that serviceability that we would require, the spare parts would require for those weapons in times of a crisis, that is where the critical vulnerability lies. Because if you're in a situation of crisis with China and Russia fails to service or provide us with those spares which we need in the times of crisis, it will dent India's defending capabilities, and it will be a source of it is an actual source of critical vulnerability.
So I come to my last question. China is the workshop for the world, and we all know how it got there. There was a lot of help from the West, from the US,
Right.
from Europe. In the current circumstances, do you see India being able to get even halfway to where China has?
That's $1 million question, and I like to be optimistic. And I mean, things are optimistic for us. I mean, there are certain things that are going our way, but there are things that even the government needs to have a right policy for being able to capitalize on this window of opportunity. So I think we have a short window of opportunity for of about 5 to 7 years. I think geostrategically we are well placed. So the geostrategic warrants the companies that have invested in China to move out, both because of the pressure that US has created and the pressures that China itself has created on its private enterprises. China has not made it easy for the private enterprises, let alone the foreign businesses, to continue or run the business as usual. They are concerned about the business environment in China. Regulations have been very strict, and it's not the ease of doing business in China is not very great. And add to that the geopolitical and the geostrategic alignment that is going down and going on in the world. So it warrants. There are countries that are you actually there are companies that are actually looking for viable alternatives, and in those viable alternatives, if we count them, we can count them on our fingers. Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, and India, along with India, they emerge. India has a bright future, but but the funny part is that for India to be able to become a global manufacturing hub, of some sort of global manufacturing hub, and to uh, take the pie out of the cake, it has to liberalize some of its uh, inverted duty structure. So, for example, if wants to assemble more iPhones in India, uh, and India also, if, let's say Foxconn comes and establishes a factory here, it will still require those tiny equipment, which go into the assembling of those products. And because for years iPhone has been assembling those products in China, it has
Yeah.
created a very extended supply chain network of these components in China. Still, they'll have to be sourced, even if the assembly is moved to India. Those critical parts, until and unless India itself produces those tiny parts or the supplements that go into the assembling of these equipment, has to be imported from China. But if India raises bar on these products that are sourced from China, it will actually hurt India's exports. So you have to look
Mhm.
which are the sectors where you should actually apply trade barriers.
Yeah.
So yeah, so these kind of things India has to be very careful of. If India wants to be, and it will eventually come, right? If today India starts assembling iPhones in India, so Apple released a list of suppliers, and in the list of around 200 suppliers, it had around 180 suppliers of the component that go into the assembling of the iPhones from China. And India had a very humble number of like 5 to 6, and that number has actually increased in the list of suppliers that iPhones sources from India. So in the meantime, so long we are not able to service those requirements, India will have to see if those requirements can be serviced from China. And this is true for actually a lot of products, all the assembling products that are there in the electronics segment, uh, from phones to laptops, from iPads, etc. So this is something which we have to be careful about.
Amit, we are at the end of our time, but clearly, from what you're telling me, we have very, very tough choices ahead. There is evidence that the government is trying to do something in this regard. We'll have to see a few years down the line how well they've worked and whether there's something further down the road. Amit, thanks very much for all that insight and information. And it's great having you here on StratNews Global.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And for those of you who joined us on this conversation, do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media, follow us on Twitter. Thank you very much. Good night.